Imagine moving into what seems like the perfect neighborhood, only to realize that no matter how hard you try to fit in, you're seen as nothing more than an outsider. But what happens when the one person who wants you gone ends up needing you the most? This is the story of a young boy who changed the heart of the most stubborn woman in the neighborhood, revealing that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can break through the toughest walls of prejudice. But the question is, will that kindness be enough to overcome a lifetime of bitterness? The moving truck rumbled down the pristine, tree-lined street of Metteridge, breaking the usual stillness that blanketed the neighborhood. Curtains shifted, blinds tilted, and curious eyes peered out of windows as the truck finally came to a stop in front of the modest yet charming house on Rosewood Lane. Jordan Thompson, a tall, elegant woman in her late 30s, stepped out of her car and looked around, taking in the manicured lawns and symmetrical flower beds of her new surroundings. This was it, the fresh start she had worked so hard to secure for herself and her son Elijah. A few feet away, Mrs. Helen Bennett watched from her porch, lips pursed in disapproval. Her gaze sharpened as she noticed Jordan's calm confidence. Mrs. Bennett had lived in Metteridge for over 40 years, and she'd prided herself on keeping track of everything that went on in the neighborhood. So when a new family, a black family, moved in next door, her thoughts darkened with a mixture of suspicion and unease. Jordan seemed out of place here, Mrs. Bennett thought, though she would never say it aloud. Not because Jordan was loud or disrespectful, quite the opposite. Jordan's presence, with her sharp business suit and poised demeanor, was too strong, too bold for the neighborhood's quiet, restrained atmosphere. And if there was one thing Mrs. Bennett hated, it was change. "Who does she think she is?" Mrs. Bennett muttered under her breath, gripping her teacup a little too tightly. "Walking around here like she owns the place." Across the street, David Matthews, a kind-faced man with graying hair, glanced toward Mrs. Bennett's house and shook his head slightly. He'd known Helen Bennett for years, and he recognized that look, a look of guarded hostility. But David, unlike his old friend, felt a pang of sympathy for the new family. He had seen too many good people pushed to the margins of Metteridge, subtly yet surely excluded from its tightly knit social fabric. He decided then and there that he would be the first to welcome them properly. "Looks like you've got your work cut out for you," he called cheerily, walking across the street with a welcoming smile. Jordan turned, momentarily startled, but she relaxed as David's warm demeanor enveloped her. "Yes, just settling in," she responded, her smile genuine but tinged with the weariness of the long day. She brushed a loose strand of hair from her face and extended her hand. "Jordan Thompson." "David Matthews," he replied, shaking her hand firmly. "Welcome to Metteridge. If you need anything, tools, help unloading, don't hesitate to ask." Jordan's smile brightened. "Thank you. It's nice to finally meet a neighbor." Before David could respond, the sound of a basketball bouncing echoed from behind the truck. Elijah emerged, dribbling the ball effortlessly as he scanned the street, his eyes wide with curiosity and hope. The 12-year-old was a miniature version of his mother, tall for his age with a shock of curly hair and a smile that radiated pure enthusiasm. Elijah turned, spotting David, and offered a small, hesitant wave. "Hi, I'm Elijah," he called out, his voice clear and eager, as if he was already imagining the friends he might make here. "Hello there, Elijah," David replied warmly. "You play ball, huh? There's a nice court down at the park, only a few blocks away. You should check it out sometime." Elijah's eyes lit up, and he nodded enthusiastically. "Maybe I will. Thanks, mister." But before Jordan could thank David for his kindness, a movement caught her eye, a curtain twitching in the house across the street. Mrs. Bennett's face was just visible through the narrow gap, her expression tight and watchful. Jordan's smile faltered slightly. She'd seen looks like that before, looks that spoke volumes without saying a word. It wasn't open hostility, but it was far from a welcome. David followed her gaze and cleared his throat awkwardly. "Don't mind Helen," he murmured softly. "She's set in her ways." Jordan nodded, masking the sting of the unspoken judgment with a polite smile. She was used to this, used to the double takes, the narrowed eyes, and the silent barriers that seemed to spring up wherever she went. But she wasn't here for herself. She was here for Elijah, to give him the stable, happy childhood she'd always dreamed of. "Thanks again, David," she said quietly. "I appreciate your kindness." As the day wore on, the neighborhood buzzed with activity as Jordan and Elijah unpacked. But the few neighbors who passed by offered only brief nods or murmured hellos before hurrying away. Elijah, eager to make a good impression, ran around setting up his basketball hoop in the driveway. He took shot after shot, the rhythmic thumping of the ball punctuating the stillness. But no one stopped to talk. No one came over to say hello. "Mom, do you think the kids here are nice?" Elijah asked later that evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "I'm sure they are, sweetheart," Jordan replied gently, wrapping her arm around his shoulders. "It just takes time, that's all. We'll make friends before you know it." But as the days turned into weeks, things didn't get much better. The kids at the park played their own games, casting curious but wary glances at Elijah when he tried to join in. Parents steered their strollers away when Jordan approached, their smiles tight and their voices clipped. David remained friendly, stopping by to chat whenever he saw them outside. But most of the other neighbors seemed to keep their distance. And then there was Mrs. Bennett. She never said a word to them, but her disapproving stare followed them everywhere. Every time Elijah played in the yard, every time Jordan mowed the lawn or planted flowers in the garden, Mrs. Bennett was there, standing on her porch, arms folded, her eyes cold and judgmental. One afternoon, as Elijah practiced his shots in the driveway, Mrs. Bennett's stare seemed to bore into his back. He hesitated, the ball slipping from his hands. He glanced up, meeting her gaze, and for a moment he considered waving. Maybe if he showed her he was friendly, she'd soften. Maybe, but the look in her eyes froze him in place. She didn't see him, not really. She saw something else, a threat, a disruption, something that didn't belong. Elijah's shoulders slumped, and he picked up his ball silently, walking inside without another word. "Hey, what's wrong?" Jordan asked, looking up from her laptop as he came in. "Nothing," Elijah muttered, trying to sound casual. But the tightness in his voice betrayed him. Jordan's heart ached as she watched him slump onto the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She wanted to march across the street, demand to know what Mrs. Bennett's problem was. But what good would it do? Confrontation wouldn't help Elijah feel accepted. It would only confirm what people like Mrs. Bennett already believed, that they didn't belong. Instead, she took a deep breath, crossed the room and sat beside Elijah, pulling him close. "Hey," she whispered softly, brushing a curl from his forehead. "People will come around. Just give it time. You keep being your amazing self, and soon they'll see what I see. The best son in the world." Elijah smiled weakly, leaning into her embrace. But as the days passed, the loneliness lingered. The subtle distance, the whispered comments, and the cold stares. It all started to weigh on them both. And Jordan found herself wondering if she'd made a mistake moving here. Maybe Meadow wasn't ready for them. But then one small moment changed everything. A moment that none of them could have predicted. A moment that would start to tear down the walls that had kept them isolated and show everyone just how wrong first impressions could be. It started with a runaway dog, a dangerous intersection, and a 12-year-old boy who just wanted to make a friend. It was a breezy Saturday afternoon when the first domino fell, the moment that started to shift everything in Meadow. Elijah was in the driveway, dribbling his basketball in rhythmic beats, trying to practice a new move he'd seen on TV. He spun, faked left, and released a shot that swished through the hoop with a satisfying whoosh. For a moment he grinned, the thrill of success lighting up his face. But as his gaze drifted toward the neighborhood park, where a group of boys his age played a spirited game, his smile faded. "Come on, you can do this," Elijah whispered to himself. He hesitated for a moment, then gathered his courage, tucked his basketball under his arm, and started walking toward the park. But as he approached the edge of the court, the laughter and shouts of the boys fell silent. One by one, they glanced at him, their expressions guarded. Elijah stopped, the ball suddenly feeling heavy in his hands. Hey, mind if I join?" he asked, forcing a smile that felt too big for his face. The tallest boy, a kid with sandy blonde hair and freckles, shrugged dismissively. "We're good," he muttered, turning away. The rejection hit harder than any shove ever could. Elijah stood there, frozen, as the boys resumed their game, their laughter louder now, as if mocking him. Slowly, he turned around and walked back toward his house, his head bowed low. He didn't see Mrs. Bennet's eyes tracking his every move from her porch. But then, just as Elijah crossed the street, a sudden commotion caught his attention. A small white dog, fluffy and frantic, had slipped out of a nearby yard. It darted across the road, yapping excitedly, just as a car rounded the corner, tires screeching. The world seemed to slow down, and Elijah's heart leapt into his throat. Without thinking, he dropped his basketball and sprinted forward. "Max! No!" Mrs. Bennett's voice rang out, sharp with panic. In a blur of movement, Elijah lunged forward and scooped up the dog, stumbling backward just as the car skidded to a stop inches away. For a heartbeat, everything was still, the air thick with the smell of burnt rubber, and the driver's shocked gasp. Mrs. Bennett stood rooted on her porch, her hand clutching the railing as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her face was pale, her mouth open in a silent cry. Elijah, breathing hard, cradled the trembling dog against his chest and looked up. Are you okay, little guy?" he murmured softly, stroking Max's fur. The dog whimpered, then licked Elijah's cheek tentatively, as if unsure whether to be scared or grateful. "Elijah!" Jordan's voice shattered the stillness as she came rushing out of the house, eyes wide with terror. She skidded to a halt beside him, her hands shaking as she pulled him into a fierce hug. "What were you thinking? You could have been hurt." I didn't want him to get run over, Mom," Elijah whispered, his voice small. "He's just a dog." He didn't know. Jordan pulled back, cupping his face in her hands, her eyes searching his. Then she glanced up, her gaze locking onto Mrs. Bennett's. The older woman stood there, rigid and silent, staring at the boy who had just saved her beloved dog. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly, Mrs. Bennett descended the steps of her porch and walked toward them. "Max," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh, Max, my sweet boy." She reached out, and Elijah gently handed the dog over. Mrs. Bennett cradled him close, burying her face in his fur, her shoulders shaking. Elijah took a step back, unsure of what to do. He glanced up at his mother, but Jordan's expression was unreadable, a mixture of relief, worry, and something else. Something wary and fragile. "Thank you," Mrs. Bennett finally said, her voice barely more than a breath. She lifted her head, her eyes meeting Elijah's for the first time without that hard, stony edge. There was something softer there now, something raw and unsettled. You're welcome," Elijah mumbled, shuffling his feet awkwardly. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at him like that, as if he were more than just a kid in the way, as if he mattered. Mrs. Bennett hesitated, her gaze flicking to Jordan. The two women stood there, a chasm of unspoken words between them. And then, very slowly, Mrs. Bennett dipped her head in a stiff, awkward nod. I should get him inside," she murmured. She turned sharply, clutching Max tightly to her chest, and hurried back up the steps, disappearing into her house without another word. For a moment, silence reigned. Then Jordan let out a long, shuddering breath and turned to her son, her eyes filled with a fierce, protective pride. "You did a brave thing, Elijah," she whispered, brushing his hair back gently. "But promise me you'll be more careful. I can't lose you." "I promise, Mom," he whispered back, his voice earnest. But even as he said it, he glanced back toward Mrs. Bennett's house, wondering what she was thinking, wondering if, maybe, just maybe, something had changed. The next morning, Mrs. Bennett's porch was empty. Elijah peered out of the window, half expecting to see her standing there, arms crossed as usual. But the old woman was nowhere to be seen. Shrugging, he grabbed his basketball and headed outside. He needed to clear his head, to feel the steady, comforting rhythm of the ball in his hands. As he started shooting, a door creaked open across the street. Mrs. Bennett stepped out, clutching something in her hands. A small, neatly wrapped package. She stood there for a moment, looking as if she were debating whether to stay or turn back. Then, with a deep breath, she walked over, her steps slow and uncertain. "Good morning," she said stiffly, stopping a few feet away. Elijah blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Morning. Mrs. Bennet cleared her throat, her gaze darting to the ball, then back to him. I, I wanted to thank you properly, she said, holding out the package. For yesterday. You saved Max, and that means a lot to me. Elijah stared at the package, then at Mrs. Bennet's face. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was the closest thing to one that he'd ever expected to get from her. Thanks, he murmured, taking it carefully. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small tin of homemade cookies. They're, they're just something I baked, Mrs. Bennet said quickly, her voice tight. Nothing special. They look great, Elijah said sincerely. He glanced up, a small, tentative smile tugging at his lips. Do you want to watch me play? I mean, only if you're not busy. Mrs. Bennet blinked, taken aback. For a long moment she just stared at him, as if trying to figure out if he was serious. Then slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. I suppose I could spare a few minutes, she muttered. Elijah's grin widened, and he picked up his ball, his movements lighter, more confident now. Mrs. Bennet watched, her expression inscrutable, as he dribbled and spun, shooting basket after basket. She didn't say a word, but every now and then, a flicker of something, pride, crossed her face. And as she stood there watching this boy play, a strange, unsettling warmth spread through her chest. Maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe the Thompsons weren't what she'd thought. Maybe. But before she could finish the thought, Elijah's voice rang out, clear and bright. Hey, Mrs. Bennet, watch this! He took a running start, leapt, and slammed the ball through the hoop with a triumphant shout. Mrs. Bennet couldn't help it. A small, involuntary smile tugged at her lips. Not bad, young man, she murmured softly. Not bad at all. And in that small, unexpected smile, the ice began to crack, just a little. The days following Elijah's brave rescue of Max brought subtle but unmistakable changes to the rhythm of life in Metteridge. Mrs. Bennet no longer stood on her porch with that rigid, watchful stance. Instead, she lingered at the edge of her lawn, hands clasped loosely behind her back, pretending to fuss over her flower beds while casting furtive glances at the Thompson house. She seemed almost hesitant, as if she didn't know quite what to do with herself. Jordan noticed the shift right away. She could feel Mrs. Bennet's gaze on her as she tended to the garden, her movements careful and precise. It was different now, less judgmental, more curious. Jordan sighed inwardly. She wasn't sure if that was an improvement, but it was something. One afternoon, as Jordan knelt beside a row of wilting hydrangeas, muttering to herself about the stubbornness of the soil, she heard a soft cough behind her. You're planting those too deep. The voice startled her, and she looked up to see Mrs. Bennet standing there, arms crossed, a faint frown creasing her brow. I'm sorry, Jordan stammered, momentarily thrown off balance. The hydrangeas, Mrs. Bennet repeated, her tone brisk. You're planting them too deep. They need to be higher, or they'll never bloom properly. Jordan blinked, glancing down at the drooping plants. Oh, I didn't know that. Mrs. Bennet huffed, but there was no bite to it. Clearly. Jordan bit back a smile, sensing something almost playful beneath the older woman's brusqueness. She shifted slightly, making room beside her. Would you like to show me? Mrs. Bennet hesitated, her gaze flickering uncertainly between the plants and Jordan's face. Then, with a small, reluctant sigh, she knelt down beside her. Like this, she murmured, her hands moving deftly, loosening the soil around the roots and gently lifting the plant higher. You want the base of the stem to be just above the ground, see? That way the roots can spread out instead of suffocating. Jordan watched, fascinated, as Mrs. Bennet worked. There was a delicate grace to her movements, a tenderness that belied her stern exterior. Thank you, Jordan said softly. Mrs. Bennet shrugged, wiping her hands on her gardening gloves. It's nothing, just basic gardening. But it wasn't nothing, not really. It was the first real conversation they'd had, an olive branch extended in the language of soil and flowers. And as Mrs. Bennet stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees, Jordan found herself smiling. "Would you like to stay for tea?" she asked impulsively. Mrs. Bennet blinked, her face tightening as if the very suggestion were absurd. "I... no, no, thank you," she said hastily. "I have things to do." Jordan nodded, fighting back a wave of disappointment. "Of course, well, thank you again." Mrs. Bennet nodded curtly, then turned and walked stiffly back to her house. But as she reached her porch, she paused, glancing back over her shoulder. For a moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, something tentative and fragile, like the first green shoot of a seed just beginning to sprout. "Keep an eye on those hydrangeas," Mrs. Bennet called gruffly. "They're stubborn plants." Jordan laughed softly. "I will." From then on, their interactions took on a new rhythm, a quiet, unspoken routine that neither of them acknowledged aloud. Mrs. Bennet would pause by the Thompsons' garden every now and then, offering brusque but surprisingly helpful tips. Jordan would nod, listening carefully, making adjustments as needed. And when Mrs. Bennet wasn't around, Elijah would sneak out with a watering can, diligently tending to the plants under his mother's watchful eye. It was a strange, delicate dance full of half-smiles and guarded glances. But it was progress. Small, incremental progress. The real breakthrough, however, came a week later. Elijah was practicing his shots in the driveway, the steady thump, thump, thump of the ball echoing through the still afternoon. Mrs. Bennet sat on her porch, Max curled up beside her, his tail thumping lazily against the wooden planks. She wasn't watching Elijah. Not really. She was just observing. "Elijah," Jordan called from inside the house. "Can you take the trash out, honey?" Elijah sighed, setting the ball down reluctantly. "Yeah, okay, Mom." He trudged over to the side of the house, hauling the heavy trash bag toward the curb. But as he struggled to lift it into the bin, the bag split, spilling its contents across the street. "Aw, man," Elijah groaned, glancing around helplessly. He didn't notice Mrs. Bennet stand up until she was right beside him. "Here," she muttered, bending down stiffly. "Hold the bag open. You're making a mess." Elijah stared at her, wide-eyed. Okay." Together, they gathered up the scattered trash, wilted lettuce leaves, crumpled soda cans, a stray sock that Elijah hurriedly shoved behind his back, cheeks flaming. Mrs. Bennet didn't say a word, her expression inscrutable. But when they finished, she straightened up slowly, her gaze lingering on Elijah's face. "You should double bag it next time," she said quietly. "That way, it won't rip so easily." Elijah nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, I will. Thanks, Mrs. Bennet." She didn't respond. She just nodded once, then turned and walked away. But as Elijah watched her go, something inside him shifted, a small, cautious flicker of hope. "Mom!" he burst out as he ran back inside, his voice bubbling over with excitement. "Mom, Mrs. Bennet helped me with the trash." Jordan looked up, startled. "She did?" "Yeah, I mean, she didn't, say much, but I think she likes me." Elijah's grin was so bright, so full of pure, unfiltered joy, that Jordan felt her heart squeeze. "That's wonderful, sweetie," she said softly, wrapping her arms around him. "That's really wonderful." After that, the interactions between the Thompsons and Mrs. Bennet became more frequent. Elijah would wave cheerfully whenever he saw her, and Mrs. Bennet, after a few weeks of stiff, awkward nods, started waving back. Jordan would smile at her in passing, and Mrs. Bennet would respond with a gruff, almost imperceptible nod. And then, one day it happened. Elijah was shooting hoops in the driveway when he spotted Mrs. Bennet struggling to carry a heavy bag of groceries up her porch steps. Without a second thought, he dropped the ball and sprinted over. "Here, let me help you," he exclaimed, reaching for the bag. Mrs. Bennet stiffened, her mouth opening as if to refuse. But then she paused, glancing down at Elijah's eager, hopeful face. With a small, resigned sigh, she released the bag. "Fine," she muttered, "but be careful. I've got eggs in there." Elijah grinned, lifting the bag carefully. "Yes, ma'am." They walked up the steps together, Mrs. Bennet hovering behind him like an anxious hen. When they reached the top, Elijah set the bag down gently, glancing up at her expectantly. "Anything else I can do?" he asked, his voice earnest. Mrs. Bennet stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, a small, reluctant smile tugged at her lips. "No," she murmured softly. That's, that's all. Thank you," Elijah beamed. "You're welcome, Mrs. Bennet." From then on, a strange sort of friendship began to blossom between them. Mrs. Bennet still maintained her gruff exterior, but she started leaving small treats for Elijah on her porch. An apple pie here, a bag of homemade cookies there. Elijah, in turn, would bring her flowers from the garden, his eyes sparkling with excitement as he watched her carefully arrange them in a vase. Jordan watched it all unfold with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. It was as if Mrs. Bennet were thawing, bit by bit, under the warmth of Elijah's unrelenting kindness. And every time the old woman smiled, really smiled at her son, Jordan felt a small, tentative joy bloom in her chest. But it wasn't just about Elijah anymore. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Mrs. Bennet began to reach out to Jordan as well. She would pause by the garden to offer advice, her voice softer now, less sharp. She would nod politely when Jordan passed by, a small, almost shy smile playing at her lips. And then, one rainy afternoon, she did something that stunned them both. Jordan was struggling to carry a heavy bag of mulch up the driveway when Mrs. Bennet appeared beside her, holding an umbrella over both their heads. "Let me help," she murmured quietly, reaching for the bag. Jordan stared at her, mouth agape. You don't have to." "I know," Mrs. Bennet said briskly, "but I want to." They stood there for a moment, the rain pattering softly around them. Then slowly, Jordan released the bag. Together they carried it to the garden, neither of them speaking, both of them smiling just a little. It was a small gesture, tiny really in the grand scheme of things, but to Jordan it felt like the beginning of something fragile and precious. And maybe, just maybe, it was. The Meadow Ridge Neighborhood Festival was the highlight of the year, a grand event that transformed the sleepy suburban streets into a whirlwind of activity. Colorful tents lined the park, children's laughter filled the air, and the scent of popcorn and barbecue mingled with the crisp autumn breeze. For the first time since moving in, Jordan felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was their chance to finally be a part of the community. "Wow, look at all this, Mom," Elijah breathed, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. Families strolled by, chatting and laughing, while kids darted between booths, their faces smeared with cotton candy. The energy was infectious, and for a moment, Elijah felt like any other kid, just a part of the crowd. Jordan smiled softly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Yeah, it's something, isn't it?" She glanced around, her gaze searching for a familiar face. Mrs. Bennet had mentioned she would be attending, but so far there was no sign of the elderly woman. "Come on," Jordan said, nudging Elijah gently. "Let's check out the games." They made their way through the bustling crowds, pausing to admire the various stalls. But as they moved, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Whispers floated through the air, just barely audible. Hushed voices, quick glances, and then silence when they passed by. "There they are," a woman's voice murmured. Jordan stiffened but kept walking, pretending not to notice. "Can you believe they're actually here?" "I heard they were causing trouble again," someone else muttered. Jordan's heart tightened painfully, the excitement she'd felt draining away. She forced herself to keep her smile in place, but Elijah's shoulders slumped beside her. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "We're here to have fun. Don't let them get to you." Elijah nodded, but the sparkle in his eyes had dimmed. They reached the game booths, and he perked up slightly, pointing to a basketball shooting game. "Can I try, Mom?" "Of course," Jordan said, grateful for the distraction. Elijah handed over $1 and took his place at the line. As he squared his shoulders and aimed for the hoop, Jordan noticed a small group of boys watching from the sidelines. Her chest tightened. She recognized them. They were the same boys who had ignored Elijah at the park. "Hey, isn't that the new kid?" one of them whispered loudly. "The one who lives in that weird house?" "Yeah, what's he doing here?" another boy sneered. "Probably thinks he's some kind of big shot." Jordan clenched her fists, biting back a retort. But before she could step in, Elijah shot the ball. It sailed through the air, arcing perfectly, then swished through the hoop with a satisfying whoosh. "Yes!" Elijah pumped his fist. grinning broadly. The boys exchanged glances, their sneers faltering. One of them, a lanky kid with a shock of red hair, stepped forward, his face twisted in mockery. Bet you can't do it again, he taunted, crossing his arms. Elijah's smile wavered. I can. Prove it. Jordan's heart ached as she watched her son's confidence falter. She wanted to tell him to walk away, to ignore them. But before she could speak, Elijah squared his shoulders again. I'll prove it, he said quietly. He took a deep breath, his gaze focused and intense. The crowd seemed to hold its breath as he released the ball. It soared through the air and swished through the hoop again, as clean and perfect as the first shot. The boys stared, stunned into silence. For a moment, Jordan felt a swell of pride so fierce it nearly brought tears to her eyes. But then, the red-haired boy sneered, his eyes narrowing with malice. Big deal. Anyone can get lucky twice. Bet you can't do it 3 times. That's enough, Jordan snapped, stepping forward, her voice low and firm. But before she could say more, a new voice cut through the tension. He doesn't have to prove anything to you. The crowd parted and Mrs. Bennett stepped forward, her gaze sharp and unyielding as it swept over the boys. They flinched under her scrutiny, shifting uneasily. Elijah is a fine young man, Mrs. Bennett continued, her voice clear and strong. And he's got more talent and courage than any of you bullies combined. The boys gaped at her, clearly unsure how to respond. But Mrs. Bennett didn't wait for an answer. She turned to Elijah, her expression softening. Don't you pay them any mind, Elijah, she murmured. You did just fine. Elijah stared at her, wide-eyed, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Then slowly, a tentative smile spread across his face. Thanks, Mrs. Bennett, he whispered. Mrs. Bennett nodded briskly, then turned her gaze back to the boys, her eyes flashing. Now, unless you want to embarrass yourselves further, I suggest you find something better to do. They scattered like leaves in the wind, muttering sullenly under their breaths. Jordan watched them go, her heart pounding. Then she turned to Mrs. Bennett, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she murmured softly. You didn't have to. Yes, I did, Mrs. Bennett interrupted, her voice low. It's time people understood that the Thompsons belong here just as much as anyone else. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that seemed to ripple through the crowd. Whispers broke out, low murmurs of surprise and disbelief. Mrs. Bennett, of all people, standing up for the Thompsons? It was unheard of. But she wasn't finished. Ever since they moved in, people have treated them like they're outsiders, Mrs. Bennett said, raising her voice. But they're not. They're part of this community, and they deserve the same respect as anyone else. A murmur ran through the onlookers, a mixture of shock and confusion. Mrs. Bennett lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping over them all. I've lived here a long time, she continued, her voice ringing out. And I've seen families come and go. But Jordan and Elijah, they're good people, decent, hard-working people. And I'll be damned if I stand by and let them be pushed out just because they're different. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some people looked away, their faces flushed with shame. Others met her gaze, a flicker of guilt in their eyes. But he's a troublemaker, a voice shouted suddenly. Jordan's heart dropped. She turned, her eyes narrowing as a stocky man stepped forward, his face red and angry. He's always snooping around, getting into places he shouldn't be, the man snapped. And now there's been a theft. My son's bike was stolen yesterday, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was him. A gasp rippled through the crowd, and Jordan felt a surge of anger so fierce it almost choked her. That's a lie, she cried, stepping forward. Elijah would never. I didn't take anything. Elijah's voice rang out, high and trembling. He looked up at the man, his eyes wide and pleading. I didn't, I swear. Then where's the bike, huh? The man sneered. Where? Enough! Mrs. Bennett's voice cut through the commotion like a blade. She stepped forward, her gaze blazing. How dare you accuse this boy without a shred of evidence? She demanded. Do you know how many times I've seen your son run through my flower beds without a word of apology? Should I accuse him of trespassing? Should I call the police? The man faltered, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Mrs. Bennett advanced on him, her eyes flashing. Your son's bike is missing, she said, her voice low and fierce. That's unfortunate, but that doesn't give you the right to point fingers at an innocent child just because he's new, just because he's different. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. The man flushed, his face a deep, angry red. But he didn't speak. He just glared at Mrs. Bennet, his fist clenched at his sides. That's what I thought, Mrs. Bennet murmured coldly. Then slowly she turned to Elijah, her expression softening. You listen to me, Elijah Thompson, she said quietly. You don't let people like him make you feel small. You hold your head high, understand? You've got nothing to be ashamed of. Elijah swallowed hard, tears shimmering in his eyes. He nodded, his lower lip trembling. Yes, ma'am, he whispered. Mrs. Bennet smiled, a small, tender smile that seemed to light up her entire face. Good boy, she murmured. Then she turned to Jordan, her gaze steady and unwavering. You raised him right, she said softly. Don't you forget that. Jordan's throat tightened. She nodded, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. Thank you, she whispered. Mrs. Bennet nodded curtly, then turned back to the crowd, her shoulders straight and her head held high. I think we're done here, she said sharply. If anyone else has something to say, you'd better have the guts to say it to my face. No one spoke. The crowd shuffled uneasily, glancing at each other, then at Mrs. Bennet. Slowly, one by one, they began to disperse, muttering quietly among themselves. Jordan let out a long, shuddering breath, her heart pounding wildly. She turned to Mrs. Bennet, searching for the right words, any words, that could express what she was feeling. But Mrs. Bennet just shook her head. Don't, she murmured quietly. Just take care of yourself and that boy of yours. Jordan nodded, swallowing hard. I will. With that, Mrs. Bennet turned and walked away, her shoulders stiff and unyielding. But as she glanced back over her shoulder, her gaze met Jordan's, and a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at her lips. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And as Jordan stood there, holding Elijah close, she realized something had shifted, something fundamental. For the first time, they weren't just the new family on Rosewood Lane. They were more than that. They belonged. In the weeks following the dramatic confrontation at the neighborhood festival, Meadow began to change. It wasn't an overnight transformation, nor was it sudden or drastic. But small, meaningful shifts started rippling through the community, like the first cracks of sunlight breaking through a storm. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact with the Thompsons began nodding politely when they passed by. Families that once whispered behind closed doors started offering tentative smiles and small waves. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was a start. One sunny morning, Jordan stood at the kitchen window, watching Elijah shoot hoops in the driveway. He moved with a new confidence now, his head held high and his shoulders square. There was a lightness in his step that hadn't been there before, a sense of belonging that filled Jordan's heart with a fierce, protective joy. And it wasn't just Elijah who had changed. Jordan glanced across the street, where Mrs. Bennet stood on her porch, a cup of tea in hand. Their eyes met, and the older woman lifted her cup slightly, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at her lips. Morning, Jordan called, waving cheerfully. Morning, Mrs. Bennet replied, her voice carrying easily across the street. It was a small thing, so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But to Jordan, it was monumental. She turned back to the stove, humming softly as she flipped the pancakes. Today was a special day, a day she'd been looking forward to for weeks. Elijah, she called, peeking out the back door. Come in and get ready, honey. We've got guests coming soon. Elijah bounded up the steps, his face flushed with excitement. Who's coming? Jordan grinned, ruffling his hair affectionately. Just a few friends? Elijah's eyes widened. Friends? He paused, his gaze searching hers. You mean, like real friends? Yes, real friends, Jordan said softly. People who want to get to know us, who want to spend time with us. Elijah's face lit up, and he threw his arms around her in a fierce hug. I knew it, Mom, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I knew they'd come around. Jordan held him close, blinking back the tears that stung her eyes. So did I, baby, so did I. A few hours later, their backyard was transformed into a bustling hub of laughter and chatter. Colorful picnic blankets dotted the lawn, and the smell of grilled burgers and hot dogs filled the air. David Matthews was there, his usual friendly smile even brighter than before. Clara, a kind-hearted woman who'd always waved from a distance, had brought a plate of homemade brownies, and Brian, the young man who lived across the street, was setting up a game of cornhole with Elijah, the two of them laughing like old friends. But the biggest surprise of all was Mrs. Bennet. She arrived early carrying a large platter of her famous apple pies. Jordan had nearly dropped the tray of lemonade she was holding when she saw her. "Mrs. Bennet," she gasped, rushing forward. You didn't have to." "Nonsense," Mrs. Bennet interrupted briskly, setting the pies down with a firm thud. "It's not a proper barbecue without dessert." Jordan stared at her, speechless. Then she blinked rapidly and cleared her throat, fighting back a wave of emotion. "Thank you. Really, this means a lot." Mrs. Bennet sniffed, waving her hand dismissively. "Don't make a fuss." But as she turned away, Jordan caught a glimpse of something soft and tender in her gaze, something that spoke of acceptance and, perhaps, a tentative sort of friendship. "Hey, Mrs. Bennet," Elijah called, bounding over. "Want to see me play cornhole?" Mrs. Bennet raised an eyebrow, eyeing the wooden board skeptically. "Cornhole?" "Yeah, it's easy. Here, I'll show you." Elijah grabbed her hand and tugged her toward the game, his enthusiasm so infectious that Mrs. Bennet couldn't help but follow. Jordan watched them go, her heart swelling with a strange, bittersweet pride. For so long, she'd worried that they would never truly fit in here, that no matter how hard they tried, they would always be on the outside, looking in. But now as she glanced around at the smiling faces and heard the warm, genuine laughter filling the air, she realized that they weren't just fitting in. They were becoming part of something bigger, something that had taken root and grown, despite all the odds. "Jordan," a voice murmured softly beside her. She turned to see David Matthews standing there, his smile kind and warm. "You've done good," he said quietly, nodding toward Elijah and Mrs. Bennet. "I've never seen Helen smile like that." Jordan glanced back at the older woman. Mrs. Bennet was holding a beanbag, her face creased in concentration as Elijah demonstrated the proper way to throw. Then she tossed it, and it landed squarely in the hole. A cheer went up, and Mrs. Bennet's face lit up with a rare, genuine smile. "It wasn't just me," Jordan murmured, her throat tight. "It was everyone. People like you." David shook his head slowly. "No, it was you. You and Elijah." He paused, his gaze steady and sincere. "You made us see. You made us better." Jordan blinked rapidly, her vision blurring. She reached out and squeezed David's hand, her heart full to bursting. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for believing in us." David smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's been an honor." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and smiles. Elijah played game after game, his joy so bright it seemed to light up the entire yard. Jordan found herself swept up in conversation after conversation, each one more genuine and welcoming than the last. People who had once barely acknowledged her presence were now sharing stories, asking questions, wanting to know more. It wasn't perfect. There were still a few who kept their distance, their smiles tight and their words carefully measured. But Jordan didn't mind. The change had started, and that was all that mattered. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the backyard in a warm golden glow, Mrs. Bennet stood up, dusting off her hands. "I suppose I'd better be getting home," she announced, glancing around the yard. "Max will need his dinner." "Wait!" Elijah cried, darting forward. "Don't go yet. We haven't even had dessert." Mrs. Bennet hesitated, glancing down at him. I really should. Please?" Elijah's eyes were wide and pleading, his hands clasped in front of him. "Just one slice?" Mrs. Bennet sighed, but a smile tugged at her lips. "All right, one slice." A cheer went up, and everyone gathered around as Jordan cut the apple pie. Mrs. Bennet accepted her slice with a small, awkward nod, then settled back in her chair, the tension in her shoulders easing. "See?" Elijah grinned, taking a big bite. "Told you it's not a party without dessert." Mrs. Bennet chuckled softly, her gaze lingering on Elijah's smiling face. I suppose you're right, young man. The warmth of her voice sent a ripple of emotion through the crowd. For a moment, everyone was silent, their gazes drawn to this small, quiet scene. The boy and the elderly woman, sharing pie and laughter like family. Jordan swallowed hard, her eyes burning with unshed tears. This, this was everything she had dreamed of. Not just acceptance, but true belonging. It had taken time and effort and so much courage. But they had done it. They had found their place. As the evening drew to a close, people began to gather their things, offering hugs and handshakes, promises to do this again soon. Mrs. Bennet stood slowly, glancing around the yard one last time. Thank you for having me, she murmured quietly to Jordan. Thank you, Jordan whispered back, for everything. Mrs. Bennet nodded, her gaze softening. You're good people, Jordan. I'm glad you're here. And with that, she turned and made her way toward the street, her steps slow but sure. Jordan watched her go, her heart swelling with gratitude and hope. Elijah slipped his hand into hers, leaning against her side. We did it, didn't we, Mom? He whispered, his voice full of wonder. Jordan smiled, squeezing his hand gently. Yes, baby, we did. They stood there together, watching as the last of the guests left, the sky above them a deep, rich violet. And in that quiet, peaceful moment, Jordan realized that they weren't just part of the neighborhood now. They were part of a family, and that, she knew, was the greatest victory of all. And that's the story of how a small act of kindness can transform even the most divided of communities. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales that remind us of the power of compassion. See you in the next one.